The wind on Valerian was always strong and dry, sweeping across the dusty plains like a forgotten memory, carrying with it the scent of metal and fire from wars that had ended years ago but never really left the soil. The broken towers of the old Eliari outpost still stood like skeletons staring into the red sky, silent and hollow, and that silence made Darren uneasy every time he passed through the outer zones, though he had walked these lands more times than he could count. His boots still left prints in the dust, as if the world wanted to remember each step he took. Darren was not the kind of soldier who spoke much. He believed in action more than words, and the only voice he trusted in the field was the hum of his scanner and the beat of his own heart. He had served through 2 alien conflicts, seen ships fall from the sky like dead birds, watched comrades vanish into the black void, and survived when others didn't. Now peace had returned, or at least something that looked like peace, but it felt thin like glass, and he didn't believe it would hold. He moved carefully through the ruins of an old Eliari research station, now mostly swallowed by sand, the sharp curves of its design bent by time and explosions. He wasn't here on official orders. His unit had cleared the area months ago and marked it safe, but Darren's gut told him something was wrong, because for the last 3 nights his comms had picked up a strange transmission buried beneath static, a broken voice speaking an old Eliari dialect, begging anyone for help. It could be a trap or a glitch or something left running by accident. But Darren had learned never to ignore voices that cry in the dark, so he kept searching until he reached a collapsed lower level where the air was heavy with rust and smoke, and the walls seemed to whisper stories of what had happened here during the war. His flashlight caught movement behind a pile of fallen steel, and he paused, every part of his body going still as he listened again to the faint echo of breathing, not mechanical, not animal, something alive. He moved the wreckage slowly, his hands steady despite the pounding in his chest, and then he saw her, a small figure curled in a corner, limbs thin, eyes wide with fear, skin faintly glowing with Eliari biolite, which flickered weakly as if nearly gone. She looked no older than 10, wrapped in a tattered medical wrap, one arm bandaged poorly, and her lips cracked from thirst. She did not speak. At first only stared at him, as if unsure whether he was real or another nightmare from her broken mind. Darren crouched low and took off his helmet, letting her see his face. He offered water, not words, and she drank slowly, watching him like a cornered animal, unsure if kindness was just another trick. When she finished, she whispered a name so soft it almost didn't reach him. Mira. Her voice held a strange rhythm, like a song she no longer remembered how to sing, and when he asked where she came from, she only pointed upward and said sky, then silence again. Recognized her features even through the dirt and damage. He had seen the royal portraits long ago during negotiations, the same sharp eyes, the same pattern of light on her skin. She looked like the missing child, the one they said was lost during the siege of the Eliari capital 6 years ago, the daughter of Queen Lyra, the one whose disappearance almost shattered the fragile treaty between human and Eliari forces. But that child was supposed to be dead, burned with the transport that vanished during evacuation. No one survived, or so they believed, yet here she was too weak to stand and too scared to run, and Darren knew in his bones that she was real, and this was no trick. No clone, no fake. He could not explain why, but the truth was in her eyes, and the way her fingers trembled when she tried to hold his hand. He set up a small shelter for the night, hidden beneath the wreckage, and treated her wounds as best as he could. With what little he had, she still said little, but when he asked her name again, she said Mira with more strength and pointed to herself, like she wanted him to believe it too. And when he nodded and said her name back, she gave him the faintest smile, the first sign of hope on her face. Later he contacted command using a private channel and told them what he found. Their reply was cold and quick: return immediately, do not interfere. Possible political fallout situation unstable, leave the area and await further orders. But Darren stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it. Without replying, he looked at the sleeping child beside him, breathing soft and slow, and felt something He had not felt in a long time the pull of purpose, not just duty, but something deeper, something human, whispered to the empty air above the ruined station. I found your child, and though no one could hear him, the words hung there like a promise, not just to the queen, not just to the Ilyari, but to himself. He would not leave her behind. Not this time. He could not save the others, but he could save her. As the sky above shifted to violet and the moons began their slow dance across the stars, Darren prepared his pack, checked his gear, and gently lifted the child into his arms. Her head rested against his shoulder, her breath steady and warm, and though she was light, he felt the weight of the galaxy in that moment. He was not just carrying a lost girl. He was carrying the hope of peace, the spark of a future that had almost been lost. And so with quiet steps and steady resolve, he walked into the night, not as a soldier following orders, but as a man who chose to do what was right, even if no one would ever know. The wind had softened by morning, though the dust still hung in the air like a quiet warning. Darren moved carefully through the broken terrain, his steps slow and silent as he carried the girl wrapped in his field jacket. Her head rested lightly against his chest, and though her body was weak, her breathing was calm now, steady and gentle, as if something deep within her had decided it was safe at last to let go of fear. He didn't speak to her during the walk, letting silence stretch between them, not as an empty space, but as a kind of comfort, a way to say, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Reached the edge of the ruins by midday, where Darren had hidden his portable shelter beneath the wreck of an old scout transport. It wasn't much, just a frame and canvas, shielded from drones and skywatch sensors, but it was enough to give the child rest, and it gave him time to think. He set her down on a cot gently and checked her wounds again, the bruises across her arms, the older scars on her back, the markings that told a silent story of pain too long endured. It made something inside him tighten with anger, but he kept his face calm, because she was watching him with those pale glowing eyes, not with fear anymore, but with something else, something closer to curiosity, or maybe trust. He offered her food, a small pack of emergency rations, which she sniffed first, then tasted cautiously, like she wasn't used to eating without permission. When she finished, she looked at him and touched her chest with 2 fingers, saying her name again, Mira, a little louder than before. And this time when he repeated it, she nodded slowly, then raised one hand toward him, waiting, and when he reached out, she took his fingers gently, as if testing whether they would vanish. Darren leaned back against the wall of the shelter and stared at the old transmitter he had repaired last week. It still worked. If barely, he could send messages back to base, or to the neutral station orbiting above Valarian. He could report what he had found, request help begin the process of returning the child to her people, but he didn't press the button. Something in him resisted the idea of handing her over to strangers, systems that had failed her once already. So instead, he looked at her and said softly, I think I know who you are, and I think you know it too. The child tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly, like she was searching through fog in her memory, and then she said something he didn't understand, not in the common tongue, but in an old Ilyari dialect he had heard only once before during a peace council meeting. It was a formal greeting, but also a question. Who are you, and why are you here? He answered as best he could, not with words, but with his posture, with calm eyes, with slow gestures that showed he meant no harm, and that seemed to be enough, because she relaxed again and lay back on the cot, curling into the jacket as if it were the safest thing she had ever known. Later that evening, as the orange light of the fading sun cast long shadows across the ground, Mira began to speak more, her words broken and quiet, but filled with small details. She spoke of cold metal floors, of loud voices and harsh lights, of days without names, nights without stars. She didn't say the word prison, but that's what Darren heard in the gaps between her sentences. And when she told him about the blue room with the loud machines and the long wires, he understood that she had not just been lost, she had been taken, kept hidden for reasons he could only guess. He asked her about her mother, not directly, but gently, showing her an old hollow image from the treaty hall where Queen Lyra had stood beside the human generals, her expression proud But tired Mira stared at the image for a long time, then slowly reached out and touched the face on the screen, her fingers trembling, and when he asked, "Do you know her?" she whispered a word that could mean mother or queen or home, and then buried her face in her arms as if the memory hurt too much. Darren sat beside her and didn't speak. He remembered another girl from years ago. His own sister who had gone missing during a colony raid, how he had searched for her through burning forests and broken buildings, how he had called her name until his voice failed, how they had told him she was gone, and how he had never really believed it. Now sitting beside this child, who had survived something just as cruel, he felt that old wounds stir again, but softer this time, not with rage, but with quiet understanding. When night came again, he checked the perimeter, set the motion alarms, and then sat outside the shelter watching the stars. Mira joined him after a while, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide as she looked at the sky, and for the first time she smiled. Not a big smile, just a small one, but it was real, and Darren felt something shift inside him, like the world had changed in a small but permanent way. He looked at her and said, "You don't have to be afraid anymore," and she nodded, then pointed to the stars, and said something he didn't understand, but he knew what she meant. She wanted to go home. He contacted command again, this time sending a full report and requesting an emergency diplomatic channel. The reply came faster than before, and colder return. The child immediately secure her transport. Do not speak to Aliari parties directly. Situation highly sensitive. Do not engage. Darren stared at the message, then at the girl, then at the stars, then back at the message, and without hesitation, he shut the transmitter off and began packing his gear, because he knew what he had to do, not what was ordered, not what was safe, but what was right. He knelt beside Mira and said softly, "I'll take you there myself." And she reached out and touched his hand, and for the first time she said his name. Darren slowly, quietly, like it was a word she had carried in her heart, without knowing what it meant. The stars above shifted as the moons rose higher, casting silver light across the shelter and the land beyond, and somewhere deep in the ruins, the old machine stopped humming, as if they too knew the silence now held something sacred, and so they prepared to leave, not as prisoner and guard, not as alien and human, but as two souls bound by a promise, unspoken yet stronger than any treaty, written in stone. The skies above Valerian were no longer still as Darren and Mira crossed the outer ridge in a stolen transport. The wind behind them carried dust and static, and somewhere above the clouds, satellites turned slowly, watching everything, but seeing nothing. Their ship was old, patched together from spare parts and forgotten codes. It groaned as it climbed into the upper atmosphere, yet it flew, and that was all that mattered to Darren. He sat in the pilot seat, hands steady, eyes fixed ahead, while Mira sat beside him, wrapped in a thick blanket, legs tucked under her small frame, watching the stars grow brighter through the windshield, her face quiet, but not afraid anymore. Their destination was the Aliari capital across 2 sectors and 1 restricted zone. The journey would take nearly a full day, and Darren knew they would not be alone for long. The moment he disobeyed orders, he became a target both to his own side and those who feared what the return of the Queen's daughter could mean. But he had made his choice, and there was no turning back now, not when the girl beside him had begun to smile in her sleep, not when he had seen her sit up straight and ask questions about the stars and the engines and the music he played through the ships. Old speakers. He had loaded a few songs from Earth, old melodies, slow and soft, the kind his mother once played on rainy nights. Mira listened closely, tilting her head to follow the notes, as if trying to remember something long buried. And once, when he played a song with no words, just the sound of strings and wind, she closed her eyes and whispered a line in her own language, and though he did not understand the meaning, he felt the shape of it in the air, like a lullaby. Remembered by heart, they passed through the asteroid field near Sector 5, low power, and no lights to avoid sensors. Darren maneuvered with care, his hands moving from instinct, avoiding floating debris and silent minds left over from battles long ended. Mira watched each motion, and then reached forward, pointing at the control panel, asking questions in broken words and signs, and slowly Darren began teaching her. He showed her how to read the map, how to adjust the stabilizer, how to listen to the ship's heartbeat through the vibrations in the floor, and she listened with the focus of someone who had never been allowed to learn before, and every time she got something right, she looked at him with bright eyes, and he nodded and said yes, and she smiled as if he had given her the stars. But danger found them sooner than expected. Just after they crossed into neutral space, two raider ships locked onto their signal, small, fast, armed with plasma cannons, and no questions. Darren saw them on the radar and knew they had no chance in a fight. He told Mira to hold on, tightened the straps on his seat, and pushed the ship into a dive through the rings of a nearby gas moon. The engines screamed, the hull shook, alarms flared. But the raiders lost ground, unable to follow through the thick clouds. Inside the storm, the ship was tossed like a leaf. But Mira held on, her hands gripping the edge of the seat, her eyes wide yet clear. And when Darren glanced at her, he saw not a scared child, but someone stronger than anyone had believed. He steadied the ship, guided it between lightning bolts and magnetic bursts until they emerged on the other side, covered in fire marks but still flying. And when he looked at her again, she grinned, breathless, and pointed at the stars, as if to say, "We did it." They drifted quietly after that, letting the engines cool. Darren checked the damage, nothing critical, but they had lost the comms booster, which meant no calls for help and no tracking, either a blessing and a curse. Mira found an old sketchpad in the supply locker and began to draw, at first just lines and shapes, then slowly images, stars, ships, faces, and once a symbol that looked like the royal crest, though she didn't say anything when she showed it to Darren. He nodded gently, and she returned to her sketches, humming softly to herself. Later, as they neared the capital zone, a patrol from the El Uriel fleet intercepted them, no weapons drawn but shields raised. They sent a direct command to power down and prepare for boarding. Darren obeyed, slowly explaining to Myra what was happening. She nodded without fear, her hands gripping his coat, as if she knew the moment had come. They were taken aboard a clean silver vessel, where guards with quiet faces led them through long halls to a chamber lined with light. There the two were separated, Mira escorted by attendants, while Darren was placed under watch, not in a cell, but a holding room, silent and plain. He waited for hours, hands folded, eyes closed, remembering the path that led him here, the voices that tried to stop him, the rules he broke, the quiet promise he made to a frightened girl in the ruins of a war-torn station. And he wondered what they would do now, how the Elyari would respond, what the Queen would say when she saw the child she had mourned for years suddenly alive and standing before her. When the door finally opened, a tall figure entered, not a soldier, but a royal advisor, pale robes, soft voice, eyes deep with history. She studied Darren for a long moment, then spoke in calm tones, asking where he found her, how he knew what to do, why he took the risk. Darren answered, simply told the story, without drama or excuses, just truth and silence. And the advisor listened without interrupting, and then left without a word. Sat again alone for what felt like a lifetime. Then a new sound echoed through the hall, soft like footsteps, and then a voice familiar and trembling. It said his name. Darren slowly, quietly, with a weight that carried memory and hope, he turned, and there she was, Mira, standing in the doorway, clean dressed in soft robes, her hair brushed, eyes wide and shining. Behind her stood Queen Lyra, older than the hollow images, thinner but unmistakable, her gaze locked on the girl, her lips trembling, her whole body leaning forward as if afraid to breathe. Myra looked at Darren once more, then turned to the Queen slowly, carefully. She stepped forward, stopped a few paces away, and reached out her hand. Lyra fell to her knees, her hands trembling, as she took the girl's face in her palms, whispering her name again and again, tears falling without sound. And Mira whispered one word that shattered the silence, "Mother," and then wrapped her arms around the Queen and held her close, like the world had finally returned to balance. Darren stepped back quietly, his heart heavy and light all at once, and though no one clapped, no one spoke, he felt something in the air shift, something old and broken begin to heal. The Ilyari capital was not a place built for noise. It floated above the mountain rings of their homeworld in silence, wrapped in towers of glass and crystal, each structure glowing with slow light, as if breathing the very stillness of the stars. Darren had seen many cities across many planets, but this place felt different, not because of size or strength, but because it held a memory in every wall, a memory of something ancient and broken and waiting to be healed. He stood near one of the wide balconies, now hands behind his back, guarded, but not bound, while the sun above shifted through the clouds of the upper atmosphere, casting slow blue light through the chamber around him. Had not been told much since arriving, only that the Queen had ordered no harm come to him, and that Mira had been taken for full recovery and identity verification. He accepted the silence not because he trusted it, but because he knew the next step no longer belonged to him. The moment was no longer his to shape. It belonged to the child who had survived the fire and the void, and had walked back into the arms of her people without fear. When the door opened again, it did so without sound, and a royal attendant stepped through, followed by 2 more guards, and behind them, Queen Lyra walked slowly. Each step measured, her expression unreadable, her eyes sharp yet carrying something soft beneath, like waves beneath ice. She stopped in front of Darren, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind outside pressed gently against the balcony curtains, the sound of wind chimes ringing faintly through the silence of the high tower. Then, Lyra spoke, not with anger or command, but with a voice that felt heavy with time and memory. She asked him if he knew what he had done, if he understood what it meant to bring back the one they had already buried in songs and rituals. Darren answered without hesitation. He said, "I saw a child who needed help. I saw a girl who wanted to go home. I did what anyone with a heart should have done." She looked at him closely, her gaze measuring more than words could hold, and then she turned and walked toward the far wall, where a long silver screen showed a slow stream of energy patterns and star maps. She lifted her hand, touched a point on the display, and the image shifted, showing a younger Mira standing beside her before the war, a smile on both their faces, bright and full of peace. Then, image dissolved, and another one appeared, the wreckage of the ship, the one thought to have been lost with the child on board, marked as destroyed beyond recovery. And finally a third image, the one captured recently from a drone above the ruins where Darren had found her lying among steel and dust. Lyra turned back to him, her voice low and calm. She said, "You crossed our borders without approval. You disobeyed your own command. You brought back what others feared to find, and yet, I cannot bring myself to see this as a mistake." She paused, then added, "I see in her eyes a strength I had not known, a light I feared was gone." And she says she remembers your voice in the dark. She says it helped her stand again and ask for the sky. At that moment, another voice entered the room, soft and small, but steady. It called his name, not as a question, but as a greeting, and when he turned, he saw Mira standing at the doorway, dressed now in royal white and silver, her steps sure, her eyes bright. She walked to him without hesitation and held up something in her hands. It was the drawing she had made on the ship, a picture of him beside her, the stars above them, and 2 hands joined at the center. She gave it to him, then looked up and said, "You said I would be safe, and I was. And now I want you to stay." The Queen watched this without speaking for a while. Then she moved forward and placed her hand on Mira's shoulder, her voice softer than before. She told the girl that home was hers again. No one would take her away ever again. But she also looked at Darren and said, "Sometimes it takes a stranger to bring back what was lost. Sometimes a heart not born of this world can carry our blood home better than our own kind." They led him to a hall, not of judgment, but of honor, a place where names of peacekeepers were remembered across both species, and there before a gathering of silent Ilyari and human delegates, Queen Lyra stood and told them what had happened, not as a speech, but as a story. She told them how a soldier found a voice in the dust, how that voice became a child, and how that child became a bridge Across fear and silence, she did not speak his name for records. She spoke it for hearts, for history. And when she said he brought her home, the hall remained still and then bowed in quiet respect. Darren said nothing through it all. He did not smile or raise his hand. He stood straight and strong the same way he did in every battle. But something in his chest had changed. He felt lighter, not in body, but in weight, as if the burden he had carried for years had finally lifted, not because of glory or reward, but because one small voice had called him back from the silence and reminded him why he had chosen to fight in the first place. Later that evening, when the halls had emptied and the stars above the Capitol had begun to glow in full, Myra came to him again, carrying a box inside. It was a medal crafted by Eliari hands, but marked with the seal of both empires. The Queen's seal beside the human banner, and in the center a simple design. 2 hands joined beneath a star. She handed it to him and whispered, "This means guardian in our language." And when he took it from her, he felt something warm flow through him, not from the medal, but from the trust it carried. He told her then that he would not stay, not forever, because there were still others out there, voices, still lost, still waiting. And she nodded, understanding, not with sadness, but with strength, because she knew now how far one voice could travel and how far one heart could reach. And as he walked toward the landing pad to prepare for his next journey, he looked back once and saw her standing beside the Queen, her hand raised, her eyes steady, and he knew without words that he had left something behind. Not just a memory, but a mark on a world that once thought him an outsider. And so the soldier who had walked through fire and void with a lost child in his arms stepped once more into the dark, not as a wanderer, but as a guardian whose light would guide others home. The stars moved slow above the landing field, casting silver light on the quiet surface of the platform where Darren stood alone beside his ship. The air was cool and clear, and the only sound was the soft hum of the engines warming beneath the hull, preparing for departure. He checked the systems with calm fingers, his movements smooth and practiced, but his mind was not on the journey ahead. It wandered back through moments that still echoed in his chest. The call in the dark, the girl in the ruin, the look in her eyes when she saw her mother. Again, each memory burned into him, not like pain, but like something that refused to fade. He had been offered a place among them, not just honors and medals, but a seat in the new circle forming between the two species, a promise of shared futures. Peace built on the return of one child and the courage of one soldier. But he had turned it down, not because he didn't believe in it, but because he knew his path was not to stay in palaces or attend councils. His place was still out there in the quiet corners where signals were faint and voices still waited to be heard. He had done what he came to do, and that was enough for him. Footsteps echoed behind him, soft and light, and he turned to see Mira running across the platform, her hair loose, her robe flowing behind her like a whisper of light in motion. She reached him, breathless, but smiling, and in her hands she held another drawing, not like the first. This one was larger and more detailed. It showed 2 worlds side by side, stars joining them, a bridge made of hands reaching across, and in the center not a soldier, not a queen, but a child standing tall with light around her eyes, strong and open. She handed it to him without words, and he took it gently, folding it with care and placing it inside the pouch on his chest. Then she looked up at him and said thank you, not with tears or fear, but with pride, as if she knew what those 2 words meant more than anything. And he knelt beside her one last time and said, live well, learn everything you can, and never forget how strong you are. Her hands touched his face. Briefly a quiet farewell, and then she stepped back as Queen Lyra approached. Queen's voice was soft but steady as she said, you gave me more than a daughter. You gave me a reason to keep building, and for that I owe you more than this world can repay. But Darren only shook his head and said she found her way back. I just helped her walk. And Lyra nodded with respect, not as ruler to soldier, but as one parent to another who had lost and found something too deep to name. As the engines warmed, the platform lights began to shift, signaling departure, and the guards stepped back, giving him space. Mira stood beside her mother, hand in hand, watching as he climbed the ramp and took his seat inside the ship. The controls came alive under his touch, each button glowing, each screen waking up like old friends, ready for the road once more. He looked once through the side panel, saw them standing there, two figures, in a field of stars, and he lifted his hand in a slow final salute, not by rank, but by bond. Ship rose smoothly, lifting from the platform with no sound, but the soft pull of energy, pushing against gravity, and as it turned toward the open sky, world below grew smaller but not distant, because a part of it would always remain with him in every step, in every breath, in every journey yet to come. He passed through the outer rings with ease, no interference, no questions. His ship marked now, with clearance that came from the highest order, not for his protection, but for his honor. And as he moved beyond the shadow of the moons, he let the ship drift for a while, engines low, as he watched the stars scatter across the black like pieces of old dreams waiting to be gathered again. He opened the pouch, took out the drawing, and stared at it for a long moment, then placed it beside the controls where it could remind him of what mattered: not the medals, not the missions, but the lives. Touched the children, saved the hearts, restored. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, let himself rest, not because the war was over, but because something had healed inside him, something that had been broken for too long elsewhere. Across the galaxy, news began to spread, not through headlines or broadcasts, but through stories told in ships and stations, in schools and halls. Tales of a child who returned, a queen who wept, and a human who walked into the dark and brought back light. They called him the quiet guardian, the bridge walker, the one who listened and acted not for glory, but for truth. Mira grew quickly, her voice rising in councils, her hands building new treaties, her name spoken with respect, not just as royalty, but as someone who had lived through silence and chosen to speak. She carried his story with her in every step, teaching others that hope can be found even in ruins, that kindness needs no command, and that sometimes the strongest bond is the one formed in fire and choice. And Darren continued his path across the stars, not alone, but guided by the voices he had once saved, signals that called to him not with orders, but with need. He followed them one by one, finding those left behind, those forgotten, and bringing them home, not always to family, not always to peace, but always to safety, to warmth, to the quiet promise that someone still cared. One day his ship landed on another broken world, where a child sat alone among fallen walls, and as he stepped out and reached forward with an open hand, the child looked up, eyes wide and afraid, and Darren smiled gently, not with words but with presence, and the child slowly stood, took his hand, and walked with him into the light. So the story of the soldier and the lost girl became more than history. It became a lesson, a whisper across the stars, telling all who listened that humanity is not just strength or fire or steel, but heart. And when that heart chooses to protect the helpless, the impossible becomes real, and the darkness fades. He had found a child in silence, but what he truly returned was the voice of a people, the hope of a future, and the proof that sometimes one good soul is all it takes to change the course of a galaxy. The end.